So, Doctor Who monsters. We all love them, we all hate them, and some of us just don't care. We're happy with what we got, or just don't care what we get. But the point is, Doctor Who monsters, for over the past 55 and a bit years, have been various in design and concept and ideas. And not just for the TV series, the expanded media has done the same thing. However, some Doctor Who monsters don't always get remembered. And it's not just the monsters, there's other creatures, robots, etc. Apologies for any noises you may hear. I've got a window open because it's a bit warm in here despite being February. So you might hear some noisy birds, who probably would be a good idea for a monster, thinking about it. But in all seriousness, I'm here to talk about a couple of Doctor Who monsters that I think some people just either don't remember or don't talk about as much. These are only going to be from the TV series, by the way, no expanded media. So I will be now looking at a couple of monsters I think should be a little bit more acknowledged, or at least ones I think aren't as well acknowledged. Okay, here goes nothing. Okay, just a quick rule here. I've chosen one monster of every Doctor with the exception of the 8th Doctor and the War Doctor, as this is TV only. And what do you have for those two? You've only the Master and the Daleks and the Zygons for on screen anyway. Maybe that Snake Master thing, but that's as far as we can go for it for the 8th and War Doctors, and besides that Snake Master thing was more for the 7th Doctor, to be honest, despite being in an 8th Doctor story. So yes, the 8th and War Doctor are not going to feature on this list. But I am also going to add another one for the 4th Doctor, and the reason I'm adding a second one for the 4th Doctor is because one of the options is for a story that isn't broadcast. I think you know which story I'm talking about, so I've got a second one for the 4th Doctor to have one from a story that was broadcast alongside a monster from one that wasn't. We'll get to that in a bit. So let's get started with I've got them on post-it notes, by the way. The first Doctor. First of all, we have the Rills from Galaxy 4. Now, these creatures have an interesting design. They're kind of, well, they're giant fish creatures. Okay, the design's not that interesting. But 1965, they hadn't had giant fish creatures yet, so... Oh well, and we don't even see the entirety of these fish creatures. We only see bits of them because... the story claims that we would think they are, well, grotesque if we saw them. But these creatures are actually not that bad. I mean, they look okay, certainly for audience perception. They're looking, well, by modern standards, they look a bit cheap and daft. But by 65 standards, maybe a bit daft. But it still looks impressive. These creatures are also not villains. These are one of the few monsters on this list. These lists that are not villains. These guys are actually the victims of the actual antagonists, the Dravens, specifically Margot. And so they're not the baddies. These creatures aren't really known as well because of probably the design and also the story they feature in Galaxy 4 isn't that well known, apart from the fact that episode 3 now survives. But besides that, this story isn't that well known. Despite that, I think the Rills are actually pretty good creatures, and they serve the story well, and it's interesting to have these grotesque, as they believe others would think of them, creatures be the victims and allies of the story, as opposed to the villains, and the beautiful cloned women of the story are the actual villains. Well, Margot's not a clone, she's born and bred, but the rest. Anyway, moving on to the second Doctor, we have the Macra from the Macra Terror, and also the 10th Doctor story, Gridlock. I think the Macra are actually pretty good villains. It's a pretty good monster design, and there's certainly a pretty good Macra villain in there. That's the guy who's at the controls in part 4, as we see. The others don't really do that much. They are threatening, but there isn't a huge amount to them. But I do think these giant crab creatures are a pretty good design, and I think the idea behind them is good. It's just a shame we don't actually get more about the creatures in the Macra Terror. We don't actually learn that more about them, but the creatures themselves are actually pretty good. And despite some cheap or shoddy put together animatronics, it still looks pretty good and still pretty threatening, and they serve a good job to the story. And it's actually it might be scary to some people to know that the Macra have actually been in complete control all this time, as opposed to just partly in control. I will say this for the Macra, I think they improve on a kind of what's the species background, as a background of the characters, as opposed to monsters themselves. Whilst I think the monsters themselves were better in the Macra Terror, I think the backstory about them, all the information, stuff we didn't get in the Macra Terror, I think we got that better in Gridlock, as we got history from the 10th Doctor. I don't know if they've appeared in any other expanded media, but certainly in Gridlock, the 10th Doctor talks about them like empire builders. Something we didn't quite see in the Macra Terror. The 2nd Doctor described them as parasites. Whilst by Gridlock, the 10th planet knows, the 10th Doctor, not the 10th planet, the 10th Doctor knows that they're empire builders. So, obviously, since between the Macra Terror and Gridlock, they've gone from parasites to empire builders, and then they've gone back down to just being, what did he call them? Scavengers, I guess. Yeah, I think that's what he said. Scavengers. They're now just living under New York on the motorway, at the bottom of which, and trying to grab the cars. They've got as much gas as they love at the time. I'm not sure why they're going after the cars. Maybe it's just, I don't know, maybe they just don't want their privacy being invaded. But, yeah, and they probably died after the roof came up and all the gas was sucked out. But in the meantime, they had what they always wanted, lots of poisonous gas for them to make them all powerful. So, yeah, that was pretty cool. And the Macra, despite not having that much character personality, despite a good backstory, they didn't have that much character personality like in Macra Terror. But they were still a formidable threat for the half of the episode that they got, because it was a twist in the story that it was the Macra. So, and only 45 minutes compared to the other one, which is 100. They only got about half, maybe less, of the story to have as be threatening, but they were still pretty threatening, and the build-up to that was also pretty good. 3rd Doctor now, and we have the Primoids. Now, the 3rd Doctor actually got a bit harder to choose a monster to put onto the list. There was a couple some people might not know, but are they worth talking about? Well, the Primoids, I think, are pretty good villains. The Primoids were created thanks to stuff happening at, I can't remember the place. It's been a while since I've seen Inferno. I'm going to rewatch it soon, give or take a couple of weeks. But as far as I remember, science experiments go wrong, Primoids get created. I was about to say cremated for some reason. There's also the alternative universe where they're happening. I think this is actually in the alternative universe. I don't think it's quite as much in the real universe, although there might be some signs. I think that prick of a doctor, not the Doctor, just a scientist fellow, gets turned into a Primoid in the last episode. But I think the design of these creatures is actually pretty good. All the hairy facial stuff, it makes you look like a werewolf, to be honest. But it's pretty impressive. They are pretty menacing characters. So, yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I don't really remember that much about them. I didn't really take that much readings. I really should have done, but I didn't. It's alright, I'll rewatch Inferno in a couple of weeks' time. Okay, the 4th Doctor. We've got 2 creatures to talk about here, so I'll have to be quick. First of all, we're going to talk about my original first option, and then second of all, we're going to talk about a monster that is in the story after the story this creature comes in. As I think the one I've chosen for a broadcast monster isn't that terribly well known, but first of all, the unbroadcast monster. Now, as we all know, there was one Doctor Who story from the 4th Doctor's era that wasn't finished until 2017 with animation. And I think we all know what that beautiful story was. It was, of course, Sharda. The monsters in this story are the Krags. The Krags are this kind of molten square rock creatures held together by lava, by the looks of it. And they're servants of Skagra, the villain, who is out for, who's trying to find Sullyhaven, who's actually Professor Chronotis. But they believe that Sullyhaven was imprisoned on Sharda. There's a lot of S's. But he escaped, of course, and took the disguise of Professor Chronotis. The Krags, I don't think they do that terrible amount, but they're proved to be formidable hench monsters that helps Skagra get what he wants, and they prove to be pretty good. K9's firepower is even struggling against them. However, it's I find them good. It's been a while since I checked Sharda out for the latest time, but from what I remember, these guys were pretty great creatures, and they, especially on the ship, when the Doctor was talking to all the scientists, and they found out about them. So that was a pretty good scene. So anyway, that's the Krags, but there's also, as this is a unbroadcast story, I'm also going to talk about another Fourth Doctor monster, the Fomas, which are in the next story, the Leisure Hive. These guys kind of look a bit on a kind of like lizard cactuses. I mean, there's a cactus in the next story, cactus creature in the next story, I should say. But yeah, if you look at them, they're kind of like big lizardy creatures, but yeah, and it's an interesting design to see how they've incorporated these kind of man lizards, not in the same way as the Silurians. But yeah, it's interesting. There's also interesting bit about how there's some renegade criminal ones disguising themselves as humans to buy the hive from the owners. And whilst their governments are doing this, I had a quick look at the criminals wiki page before I came up. So that's how I can actually remember more about this than Inferno. Also, I've seen this story more sooner than Inferno. But I can't say these creatures are unremarkable. I don't think they do that much. I'll have to rewatch the story eventually. But I think they do some good stuff, and I think the criminals, whilst disguised as humans, do some villainous stuff. Moving on to the Fifth Doctor, this one's technically a bit of a cheat, because this thing didn't actually meet the Fifth Doctor himself. It actually took on the Third Doctor, but it was in a Fifth Doctor story, and that is the Raston Warrior Robot. I think this is a really great designed creature. It's a silver painted guy in a spandex, but it looks really cool. And the way it jumps and teleports by jumping is really cool, and how it shoots the javelins out of its arms is great. And manages to destroy a whole bunch of Cybermen in the process. So, yeah, I really like the Raston Warrior Robot, and I think it's a good design. And manages to beat the Cybermen. It's a shame we don't get that much of it. Apparently the Quarks were actually going to appear instead, but for one reason, I think due to rights reasons or practical reasons, they weren't able to be used, or maybe it wasn't just they decided not to bother, and so instead we had the Raston Warrior Robot. The only thing is, this robot doesn't actually go up against the Fifth Doctor. He goes up against the Third Doctor for a bit, and then the Cybermen. So 5 doesn't actually meet this character, so I'm going to have to quickly add another Fifth Doctor creature in to make up. Hey, that makes 14. That makes up for this and an extra Fourth Doctor monster make up for no 8 from War Doctors, okay? Okay, I'm going to quickly put up another one. I'm going to say the androids from Earthshock, because I think the Raston Warrior Robot is one of those androids, but painted silver. At least when they reused the costume, anyway. Or they did a silver version. And the androids in Earthshock, the Cybermen used androids in the first 2 episodes. They're actually pretty good. They're menacingly walking around the caves and killing people, and eventually providing us with one of the best cliffhangers in the series. We find out who's controlling the androids. It's the Cybermen. And they are defeated a bit too quickly in part 2. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of them. But I do think they've done, there's some really good stuff in part 1 and the start of part 2 with these androids before the focus is moved to the Cybermen. And yeah, also there's the two of them seem to be a male and a female, so possibly a husband and wife. But diversity, as you get one man and one woman. The woman is supposedly, is obviously slightly shorter than the man. I don't know if that was intentional, but you can definitely tell that it is a man and a woman, and not just from the height. Also, at this point, Adric proved he was a useful companion to have until he died down in two episodes later. Yeah. So, yeah. Raston warrior robots and the Cybermen and androids from Earthshock, with the Raston warrior robot from 5 Doctors. So, yeah, those are my 5th Doctor options. 6th Doctor. This is one that you may know but not really worry about. The Board from Time Lash, aka the second Loch Ness Monster. This guy is the guy behind everything happening in Time Lash. He's the baddie, basically. This is the... I don't know if any of these other ones have been main villains. Maybe the Phones. No, I think there was another character who was a baddie in the main baddie in that one. The Macra were main baddies in that one. But those were creatures. This is an individual. So this is our first individual creature who's the main villain of a story on this list. And he's got an interesting design. He's actually a person, but he got stuck in the time lash somehow, and it ruined his face and body. And he proves to be a formidable foe, kind of being in charge, scaring people, having other people to do his dick work. Just pretty sure of it. There's a couple of other dicks in this story. And yeah, he's an interesting design. He is well known, but I don't think people talk about him as much as other villains. Especially when talking about 6th Doctor villains. You don't really talk about him. You acknowledge him, but you don't really talk about him the same way you might as like the Rani or Sil. But I think the Board is a interesting design. I think the character is pretty good. I think the actor does a good job there. And yeah, it's better than that sock puppet creature from the same story. With the funny voices. But yeah, I think Board does a pretty good job for what he had to do in a story like this. And I think he's the more threatening side of that story. It's a bit of a campier story. The Board is a bit more of the more darker, serious stuff that's going on in the story. Okay, I'm going to wrap up the classic era now with the 7th Doctor's monsters. And this one is ones you might actually know. But again, like the Board, you might not actually talk about. And that is the Gods of Ragnarok from the greatest show in the galaxy. These guys, to start off with, are just a mother, a father and a daughter watching acts in the show. And if they aren't, they rate the acts with a scoreboard, for example. WizKid, who barely did anything, is like, "Oh, this is so great, I'm so happy to be here." Didn't get a chance to perform, they immediately put up a 0. Dead. A couple of people who did act and have performances, they got 0s. Eventually, the Doctor was able to get into the real realm and discover that these were actually the Gods of Ragnarok. They wanted to be entertained for life and sit there looking bored whilst doing in their guise. So the Doctor has to perform for them in order to stop them, and they're actually pretty interesting. The concept is interesting, how they've got this whole fake greatest show in the galaxy, at least on the planet anyway. Well, once the show, show itself was all over the universe, but when they settled on that planet, they pretty much took them over, and now they just want to be entertained whilst pretending to be bored family. Yeah, I guess they're not satisfied with what they got or tried getting. So eventually the Doctor stops them with his great performances. I can't remember exactly how, but he did it. Proved to be more, the 7th Doctor got to show off a bit more comedy in this story, something that he hasn't really been doing since after Dragonfire. This is probably the most comedic. I mean, this was going to be the second story of the season before it was moved to last. But even after coming second, it's still a bit odd. because you've just had the very serious remembrance of the Daleks. So just a bit strange we got a bit more of the comedic side of the 7th Doctor back after we started the season, or in this case, towards the end. I think he loses this comedic streak for the next season, apart from maybe the standstill scene in Survival. But yeah, the Gods of Ragnarok, I think these are pretty good creatures. I don't see them as talked as much either, despite being more known. Probably the most known of the classic ones on this list, besides possibly the Macra. Now we're going to go straight to the 9th Doctor for the next monster. Okay, so these monsters here, monsters and villains from the new series, you may actually know a little bit more than some of the classic ones. But here's some ones that aren't quite as fondly remembered or talked about, or are just pretty unique designs for these creatures. So let's have a look. 9th Doctor, we start off with the Reapers, who we see in Father's Day. I'm sure they've appeared in expanded media since, but certainly these creatures are pretty good design. They're like giant mix of bats and lizard bats in a way, and they've got this kind of middle bit where they eat people with, well, I presume their stomachs. Gonna raise them from time or something, I'm not sure. So time's been damaged and they've got to heal the wounds. However, thing is with the Reapers, they just come in and eat everything and everyone. I don't really know what the point of them are, especially as after this story we've never seen them again. But I do think they've got an interesting design, and they are a pretty formidable threat in Father's Day, and eventually time has to be fixed. Even the Doctor and the TARDIS cannot withstand these creatures. They get eaten. Eventually Pete Tyler has to sacrifice himself to put history back on track, and everybody lives. I think these creatures are pretty good, and the concept's a good idea. It's just the reason they're doing all of this I'm a bit lost on. But yeah, Reapers, they're pretty good 9th Doctor villains. Even the Doctor himself couldn't hold up against them. That's worthy enough for them to be on this list. Moving on to the 10th Doctor. This one is the only one I've got on this list that we don't actually see. And I think you can probably guess what this creature is, or is by that notification. This creature appears in the story Midnight. Yeah, I think you've got it. It's the Midnight entity, who we don't see, but we see possessing Sky Silvestri. I believe that is her name. And also the trainee mechanic notices some sort of shadow running across the planet. So for one reason or another, this Midnight entity has made the computer map out a new route to the Sapphire Waterfall, something a bit different to the normal route that the the passenger transport usually goes, and it makes it stop in the middle of nowhere, and then it comes and kills the driver and the mechanic, and then hops onto the most scared person into the room and possesses them, in this case Sky, and then takes over the body of tries to also take over the mind of the cleverest person in the room, the Doctor, and everybody is panicking. I do think the Midnight Entity is a really scary and very well thought up villain. And the way it uses Sky and also attaches itself to the Doctor is pretty creepy, and you don't even need a physical form, it's mentally. So whatever this creature is, it's never answered, but I think that's a good thing, that's one of the good things. Whatever the creature is, it provides us with a really scary horror story, and does it really well. It turns the characters on each other. Because we don't know about it, we don't actually know its motive. Maybe it's another parasite or something. Maybe it's a pissed off local. For whatever reason, it provides us with a really, really great, scary creature who can make others scared just by controlling other people in the ship. As we saw, this entity might still survive. I guess it just gives up afterwards and just like, you win, I'm off. There's at least 4 people dead now. I've done my job. Alright, bye. So, I think that's just the only thing with my only issue with the entity. It's that as soon as its host body is out of the thing, and if it's potentially still alive, because they can live on the Midnight surface somehow, then it just decides to leave. It doesn't do anything else. I guess you need the episode to end anyway. Oh well. Okay, moving on to the 11th Doctor. This one is a villain we meet a little bit later on in this story, and it's not even the main villain, to be honest. It works with the main villain, symbiotic, you might say. That's right, it's Mr. Sweet from the Crimson Horror. Mr. Sweet doesn't really do an awful lot amount apart from make goo, but he's an interesting little design. It looks like a really little sort of maggoty lobster creature, and all the goo is made by him. So wow, it's a lot of goo for such a little creature. And he has an interesting relationship with Mrs. Gillyflower, played by the fabulous Diana Rigg. There isn't a huge amount to talk about this guy. I just really like this little creature. I think he gets missed a few times in conversations. But I think he's one of the best new creatures from Series 7. I love the Doctor and Clara's reaction to him when Mrs. Gillyflower reveals him. And especially the Doctor's kind of almost disgust look. that's quite funny. And the way he's killed by Ada is great. After Mrs. Gillyflower dies, and Mr. Sweet's basically running away now, the Doctor says he will take him back to a prehistoric era to live out the rest of his days, and Ada just kills him with the stick. I think that is a great scene, and everybody's reaction is just great. So Mr. Sweet doesn't do much, but is still crucial to the story, mainly because of the goo. And goo turning everybody into statues, in a way. Last two now, but unfortunately these aren't actually flesh and blood creatures, these are robots. Well, I'm allowed to put robots on this list. I've already put the Raston Morio robots and the androids, so I can put robots down for 12 and 13. 12th Doctor. The robot I wanted to talk about here is the Govox Blitzer. Short little robotic thing that tried killing everybody in The Caretaker. For some reason, again, we don't get a motive. This little thing is an interesting design. It's kind of like a robotic owl with a kind of scorpion moving thing. Scorpion, whatever, moves on its side a lot. Kind of middle. It's actually a pretty cool design. I like the use of this robot. How it's just going around killing people or attacking people for no reason. And I also think it's pretty interesting way it's used in the story. How it comes in and out of time to pretty much destroy things and kill people for no reason. Maybe there is a reason, but we don't know about it. And the way it's distracted by Danny's awesome flips is really cool. I chose something from an earlier 12th Doctor story because the last couple of 12th Doctor stories have been more recent in our minds, a bit like Series 11. So I went for something a little bit further back in his era. To be honest, 12th Doctor I think was the hardest one to choose something for, despite some great choices. The Skullbox Blitzer was the one I thought, I think that was one not many people would know about, but it's also not too recent in case they may remember it. Although, that being said, I think, thinking about it, that giant fish under the Thames in Pinhas would also be a pretty good one to talk about, in terms of not being that well known, but it is a bit more recent. So Skullbox Blitzer is the one I would eventually settled on. I thought that would be obscure, but not terribly unknown, and also not that well talked about, to be honest. The same way I got my last Doctor's story was not done the same way, because this Doctor's only had one season, so all of these monsters are more recent than any of the 12th Doctor's last couple. So now we move on to the 13th Doctor's creatures. So what's the most obscure, or the one or a monster that people don't really talk about that much? I mean, lots of people just talk about them generally, about how not so great they are, and to be fair, there isn't that many great ones. So, yeah, Series 11, and they're either well known or not that obscure, and lots of people don't really like them. I've chosen the Sniper Bots to talk about because they didn't really do that much. I think they're the least used monsters / villains in this series. Despite having 2 appearances in the Ghost Monument and Battle Around Square Collars, they had a bit to do, but overall for their stories, I don't think they were hugely necessary, and that's why I'm putting them on this list, because obscure or underrated. In this case, more for just not being that needed. So, yeah. I just put them here because I thought people would remember other creatures more, other villains more, even if out of infamousy rather than anything else. But sniper bots, I think they're good and they were utilised okay, it's just that they weren't really that needed. They weren't that necessary. Out of all of these monsters, these are the least necessary. They just turn up, shoot the characters for some reason or another. I mean, in Battlefront School Apolos, fair play, they are Tim Shaw's army, I suppose. They're left over from the ends of stuff on the planet in the Ghost Monument. But that's about it. I actually just remembered that there's also those rapping creatures from Ghost Monument as well. I think maybe I should have mentioned them. They're not that well known. The ones that take up the wrappings. Oh well, I've chosen the Stenza bot, the sniper bot, so it's too late now. But I think the sniper bot's a good design. I think if well utilised more in the future, they could become better creatures. If the Stenza are to pop up again, then I think these creatures could be better used in those stories. So, yeah, there we go. I don't think they're that great. They're one of my weaker monsters I put on this list. They're not as well remembered as the other ones, just because there isn't that much of a point at this in the stories they've appeared in so far. But until they do again, if at all, then we're stuck with them like this. So that's it. Thank you for watching. What did you think? Comment down below which monsters you think are underrated or obscure or unused or underused or not that well liked or unpopular or something. Put some stuff down below. Just say stuff. Maybe you could do one for each Doctor. Not so much for War and 8. Maybe you can put some extra ones in to make up for that. Unless you want to include expanded media. In which case, include expanded media if you want. It's your list. I just decided to do TV stories for my one. So anyway, that's it from me. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.